Welcome to your deep dive. We're tackling a foundational but often challenging subject today, the psychiatry of human sexuality.
That's right. And we're drawing our insights directly from a core chapter in Kaplan and Sadock's comprehensive textbook.
Our mission really is to quickly unpack the key psychiatric ideas, the history behind them, and how things like normal function and sexual disorders are approached clinically.
Yeah, and what's fascinating right off the bat, just looking at the source, is how much the whole idea of normal sexual behavior has, well, shifted over time.
Absolutely. The sources are clear from the start that normal is really diverse. But there are some core psychiatric criteria, right?
Yes. Generally, it needs to be a source of pleasure. It shouldn't be compulsive. It shouldn't involve inappropriate guilt or shame.
And respect for others, autonomy, that kind of thing.
Exactly. That different pleasure versus compulsion or distress. That's really the absolute key, separating just a variation from actual pathology. Modern psychiatry stresses that again and again.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Starting with history, and we're not talking recent history, we're going way back.
Right. The sources remind us. Hippocrates, way back then, was apparently the first physician recorded to point to the clitoris as the site of female sexual arousal.
Wow. Okay, and fast forward a bit.
To the Renaissance, the Reformation. You see this invention, the linen sheath. Not really for birth control as we think of it now.
More like a public health thing?
Pretty much. It was a basic condom, really, designed specifically to try and stop syphilis from spreading, which was a huge crisis back then.
Okay, but the real start of sexology as a field, that's more Victorian era, right? People like Havelock Ellis and Krafft Ebing.
Oh, Krafft Ebing. He's a critical figure. His book from 1898, Psychopathia Sexualis, it was an attempt to document basically every sexual variation known at the time.
And it was pretty detailed, I gather.
Oh, incredibly lurid detail. Dozens of case reports. Everything from, zoophilia to necrophilia. It was so explicit for Victorian standards.
So they published it in Latin.
Exactly. The early editions were in Latin specifically to keep it out of the hands of the general public. Only doctors were meant to read it, to avoid, quote, moral contamination.
That says a lot about the cultural context, doesn't it?
It really does. Hugely repressive.
Okay, context established. Now, to get how things go wrong, dysfunction, we need the basics of how the body works. The plumbing, so to speak.
Right, and the source material really emphasizes the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. That's the primary control over the physical side of things, the sex organs.
So the ANS, it's got different parts doing different jobs.
Think of it like two teams. You've got the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest side. It handles the setup.
Setup meaning?
Cholinergic stimulation. That causes the initial engorgement, the lubrication. So penile tumescence, clitoral swelling, vaginal lubrication, that's the transudate.
Got it. Parasympathetic for arousal. Then what?
Then the system kind of flips. The sympathetic system, the fight or flight side, the adrenergic one, it takes over for the climax.
So that's ejaculation in men?
Primarily, yes. And in women, it facilitates those strong, smooth muscle contractions in the vagina, urethra, uterus. That's the orgasm.
Okay, nervous system covered. But what about the brain, the chemistry driving the desire?
Good question. Neurotransmitters are huge here. The thinking is an increase in dopamine tends to increase libido, fuel that drive.
And the opposite, something putting the brakes on.
That would likely be serotonin. It's produced up in the pons and midbrain, and it's generally thought to have an inhibitory effect.
Ah, okay. Which is why SSRIs, the antidepressants that boost serotonin.
Exactly. They often have those sexual side effects, like delaying orgasm or lowering desire. It fits the model.
And there's another chemical player too, right? Oxytocin.
Yes, the cuddle hormone.
Yeah.
It gets released after orgasm. It's thought to be really important for reinforcing that pleasurable feeling, which helps with pair bonding, intimacy.
Makes sense. We also need to touch on hormones, testosterone, obviously, for low libido treatment.
Right. But interestingly, the source material points out recent studies showing estrogen is actually pretty significant in the male sexual response, too.
Really? In men?
Yeah. Apparently, decreases in estrogen in middle-aged men have been linked to more visceral fat and some changes in sexual function, kind of mirroring what happens in women.
Huh. It's a complex system, then.
Beautifully complex. But because so many things affect the ANS, stress, fatigue, medications, you name it, it's maybe not surprising that things like erection and orgasm are, physiologically speaking, quite vulnerable.
Okay, that lays the biological groundwork. But sex isn't just biology, obviously. What about the mind? Psychosexuality.
Right, the link between sexuality and our whole personality. Freud comes into play here, of course.
Libido.
Libido, that innate sexual energy, yes. But also concepts related to inhibition, like the vagina dentata.
The what now?
Vagina dentata, it's this Freudian idea of an unconscious fear, mainly in men fixated at a certain developmental stage, that the vagina literally has teeth.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and if that fear sticks around?
It could manifest later as avoidance of sex or low desire. That's the theory, anyway.
Okay, let's shift to the actual experience, the sexual response cycle. 4 phases: desire, excitement, orgasm, resolution.
Yeah, and the textbook has detailed tables, which we can't see, but we can talk about key differences, especially in the excitement phase for women.
Like what?
Well, clitoris enlarges, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But then, just before orgasm, the shaft actually pulls back, retracts into the prepuce.
Interesting. What else?
The vagina changes color quite dramatically
Yeah.
to a dark purple. That's from all the blood congestion.
Like that.
And lubrication, that transidate, appears really fast, like 10 to 30 seconds after arousal starts.
And the resolution phase. You mentioned differences there, too.
Big difference. If a woman has an orgasm, everything returns to normal detumescence pretty quickly, minutes. But if she doesn't reach orgasm,
It takes longer.
it can take several hours for things to go back to baseline, which can be uncomfortable.
Okay. This brings us to desire itself. You mentioned men generally have a higher baseline.
Generally, yes. And for men, desire often comes first, before arousal. It's the motivator to initiate sex.
But for women, it's potentially different.
Often much more varied, more contextual. The motivation might be about reinforcing the relationship, feeling close, maybe pleasing a partner. And crucially, desire might happen at the same time as arousal or even after arousal has started.
So the physical response might kick in before the mental feeling of desire.
Exactly. And related to that, a woman's subjective feeling of arousal often doesn't perfectly match her physical state.
How so?
She might have lubrication but not feel mentally turned on or feel subjectively aroused, but without the expected physical signs. The sources note this disconnect is pretty rare in men. That's a major difference in perception.
We should also probably touch on masturbation. The sources call it a normal precursor to partner sex.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Historically, though, totally different story. You mentioned Krafft-Ebing. Western culture condemned it, called it onanism.
And thought it could cause insanity. Seriously.
Some did, yes, Krafft-Ebing included. But then Kinsey came along with his big surveys.
And showed it was incredibly common.
Exactly. Nearly all men, 3/4 of women, masturbate at some point. Clinically, it's now seen as just a normal way for adolescents, especially, to manage sexual tension.
Okay, so that wide range of normal brings us to when things aren't working well. Sexual dysfunctions.
Right. These involve inhibition, not being able to respond physiologically or psychologically or experiencing pain. And the key diagnostic piece is
Just stress or impairment. It has to cause real problems for the person.
marked distress or impairment. Yes, that's crucial. The DSM-5 actually streamlines some of these categories.
Like the pain disorders.
Yeah, genitopelvic pain penetration disorder. That put together older diagnoses like dyspareunia, painful intercourse, and vaginismus, involuntary muscle tightening, into one category, focusing on the experience of pain during penetration attempts.
Let's use male erectile disorder as an example. It's common, right?
The most common reason men seek treatment, yes. And the criteria are quite specific.
How specific?
The difficulty getting an erection, keeping it, or a noticeable decrease in rigidity. It has to happen pretty much all the time. The benchmark is almost all occasions, 75 to 100%,
And for a while.
and persist for at least 6 months. And there's a quick clinical tip here for figuring out causes.
Okay.
If a man says he still gets good erections sometimes, like during masturbation or morning erections, or if the problem only happens now and then,
Then it's probably not a physical, organic issue.
usually considered negligible, yeah. The cause is more likely psychological, performance, anxiety, that sort of thing.
We also need to acknowledge folks who just don't experience desire in the same way, but aren't distressed by it.
Absolutely. The spectrum includes people who identify as asexual, they just lack sexual attraction and it's not a problem for them, or demisexuals.
They only feel attraction after a strong emotional bond forms.
Right. And these groups correctly point out that diagnoses for low desire shouldn't be slapped onto them if there's no actual distress or impairment involved.
Okay, so for dysfunctions that do cause distress, what about treatment?
The most effective approaches are often behavioral, combined with psychotherapy, what's often called dual sex therapy, involving both partners if there is one.
And the main goal is?
Reducing performance anxiety. That's often the engine driving the dysfunction.
Which leads to techniques like sensate focus.
Exactly. That's a key one. Intercourse is actually banned initially. The couple focuses just on non-genital touching, heightening sensory awareness, but with zero pressure to perform.
To stop the spectatoring.
Precisely. That obsessive self-monitoring, judging your own performance, sensate focus aims to eliminate that.
Are there specific techniques for specific issues, like premature ejaculation?
Yes. For premature ejaculation, there's the squeeze technique, physically squeezing the ridge of the penis when orgasm feels imminent, or the stop-start technique. Both aim to teach the man better control, raise his threshold for excitement.
And medication can play a role there, too.
It can. SSRIs like fluoxetine, their side effect of delaying orgasm can actually be used therapeutically in this case.
What about vaginismus, the involuntary tightening?
Treatment there often involves gradual dilation of the vaginal opening, using the woman's own fingers or graduated dilators. This is usually combined with psychological techniques like relaxation or even post-hypnotic suggestion to reduce that muscle tension and fear of pain.
Okay, let's zoom out again. Broader ideas about sexuality. Sexual orientation is a big one.
Huge. And one of the most significant shifts in modern psychiatry has been its normalization. It used to be seen as a pathology, remember?
Right. But the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the DSM back in 1973.
A landmark decision. And this continued globally. The World Health Organization removed all related diagnoses from the ICD-11, the international classification, just recently in 2019.
What was the scientific reasoning for that change?
It really boiled down to Robert Spitzer's criteria for what constitutes a mental disorder. It has to cause subjective distress or objective impairment in functioning.
And for well-adjusted gay and lesbian people?
Those criteria just didn't apply. Their orientation itself wasn't the source of distress or impairment.
But we do see higher rates of some mental health issues in LGBT individuals sometimes. How is that explained?
That's explained by minority stress. It's not the orientation itself causing problems like anxiety, depression, or substance abuse. It's the chronic stress that comes from living in a society with stigma, prejudice, and ingrained heterosexist attitudes. The stress is the problem, not the identity.
Okay. Let's pivot to paraphilias. These are intense, persistent sexual interests that aren't focused on typical genital stimulation with consenting adults.
Right, and the DSM-5 makes a really critical distinction here. It separates having a paraphilia from having a paraphilic disorder.
So you can have the interest without it being a disorder.
Absolutely. The disorder is only diagnosed if the paraphilia causes significant distress or impairment to the person, or if it involves personal harm or risk of harm to others.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Sexual masochism, deriving pleasure from pain or humiliation, that's considered a benign paraphilia unless it involves dangerous acts like asphyxiophilia, choking, or causes the person immense distress. The interest isn't the disorder, the harm or distress is. That focus on harm and lack of control seems related to another concept, sex addiction. It is related, but distinct. The sources define sex addiction not by what the sexual behavior is, but by a pattern. Two key things.
Yep.
Recurrent failure to control the behavior.
Like trying to stop, but can't.
Exactly. And continuing the behavior despite significant harmful consequences to relationships, work, health, whatever.
And this isn't just about paraphilias.
No, that's crucial. Sex addiction can absolutely apply to non-paraphilic behaviors.
Yeah.
Compulsive masturbation, excessive porn use, compulsive use of prostitutes, even an addictive pattern in pursuing romantic relationships.
Which the source says is sometimes seen more in women focusing on the emotional side.
Right. The bottom line for addiction is the loss of control and the resulting harm, not the specific sexual act itself.
Okay, one last area. Terminology around gender identity.
Important to clarify. Sex generally refers to the biological stuff, chromosomes, anatomy. Gender refers more to social roles and, critically, a person's internal sense of identity.
And gender dysphoria.
That's the DSM-5 diagnosis. It involves two things. First, a marked incongruence between the gender someone experiences or expresses and the sex they were assigned at birth. And second, like other disorders, there must be clinically significant distress or impairment associated with that incongruence. Both parts are needed for the diagnosis.
Okay. Wow. We've covered a lot of ground. So what does this all mean when we step back?
Well, I think this deep dive really shows how sexuality is tangled up in everything, our biology, our history, culture, our individual psychology. It's incredibly complex.
And the field itself has changed so much from, moral judgments to focusing more on distress, impairment, and harm.
Definitely. Key takeaways for you listening. Remember that normality is really a moving target, a cultural idea that changes.
And the basic biology of sex, the ANS stuff, it's quite sensitive to outside influences, stress, drugs, even just psychological pressure.
Right. And maybe the biggest takeaway, modern psychiatry sees sexual orientation as just normal human variation. The focus now is on helping people when there's genuine distress or dysfunction, or when behaviors cause harm.
The source materials mention this idea of cultural attitudes swinging like a pendulum back and forth between being more liberal or more repressive about sex.
Yeah, that's an interesting point they make.
So, thinking about all the science we've discussed, Kinsey's findings, the clinical criteria, the changes in the ICD, what might be the next commonly held belief about sexuality that science challenges? Where might that pendulum swing next because of new understanding?
That is a fascinating question to think about, isn't it? What assumptions are still out there waiting to be re-examined?
Definitely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the psychiatry of human sexuality. We appreciate you tuning in. Until next time.